Light Pollution News, May 2025, Operation Daylight Forever. This week, how does light make you feel? Can satellites change the chemistry of our atmosphere? And did you know that you can buy old bridge lighting? A man in Queens did just that. Well, most of the Brooklyn Bridge. This month, we welcome back conservationist Michael Calhoun, landscaper Phyllis Gricus, and astronomer Dr. Robert Massey. All this and more coming your way. It's time for Light Pollution News. I'm your host, Bill McGeaney. Each month, we gather the news together and bring on three great guests to talk about the goings-on. I want to welcome any first-time listeners who may be joining us today. We publish this show twice a month, diving into the topics around nighttime preservation in our highly dynamic societies. Hey, before we begin, I just want to make you aware of a few quick things. First, if you're curious about anything you hear today, jump over to our show notes and our website for a detailed listing of all of today's articles, summaries, and read-along. Also, we have an ecology tab updated every episode with the most up-to-date research and news on how artificial light at night affects ecology. Next, we love our listener mail, so feel free to reach out and ask questions, share comments, or otherwise connect with us. You can find all of those in the show notes via whatever podcast player you're using right now, but to quickly summarize, you can find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, and Facebook. Finally, we have a good chunk of costs and effort that go into bringing you this show twice a month. Some of that is covered by our gracious listeners, but we still have many big gaps that we're looking to fill. Costs involve the show production, which is largely me, including research and show builds, show engineering, that's our man Caden, and a robust social media program, that's Caitlin. If you like what we're doing, why not consider becoming a supporter? You can learn more about the benefits of being a supporter via today's show notes. The cost is very low. It starts at $3 a month, which makes it one of the cheapest ways you can actually continue to help expand awareness and communication around the topic of a sustainable night. If you're able to, and you find this show valuable, why not support the show? For you, the listener who already supports Light Pollution News, thank you very much. Your assistance helps us go a long way to pay down our costs each month, so really appreciate it. I'm very glad you can join us today. With me are three really great guests that I'm excited to have on. First up, we have Phyllis Gricus, and Phyllis is a 25-year veteran of the landscape design world, and she is the principal of the Landscape Design Studio, LLC, located in Pittsburgh, PA. Phyllis, what got you started doing the actual opening up Landscape Design Studio, LLC? Was that always a dream? Was that something that you were going down the path? Because I know you mentioned in the last episode, you kind of went down this funnel. That's a big leap.
Well, I should clarify that while I was always interested in the environment, that came from the viewpoint of loving to be outdoors, hiking, kayaking, and living in Pittsburgh, which has its own environmental issues. I was leaving a career in sales, and I've always loved gardening, and I thought, well, now I have this time, I'm going to become a master gardener. I started there, and people started asking me to do containers and window boxes, and that's where my business started off in much smaller scale. And when I learned about professional development opportunities like universities like Penn State or Ohio University that expanded my knowledge and learning what all was available out there. And I really, probably had I known what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would have gone to become a landscape architect. But as it is now, I hire landscape architects for jobs when I need additional help. Also, I think what my career took off was when initially I would do a landscape design and I would hand it over to the homeowner to implement, and they would hire some landscaper. And I found the only thing similar to the plan that they paid me for maybe were the shape of the bed lines. They would often make plant changes without any thought to bloom sequence and all of those wonderful things that I think about as a landscape designer, or even how large it would grow. So when I decided that I would only do work, and I would tell my clients up front, where I am involved in the project management of it. I do not have my own contractors, but I've developed over the years a group of contractors that I work with and purchasing the plants. So I know they're getting the right plants, and I'm there on planting day to make sure they get planted properly and the soil test is done. And that's when really my landscape business took off, and that just led to Landscape Design Studio LLC.
Last episode you mentioned that you do whitewater kayaking.
I do.
Where do you go? A chance.
Yes, I grew up going down to Ohio Powell, slipping into other people's rafting trips. You know, someone shows up with their group and inevitably someone didn't show up and they always needed an extra person. So I was there getting my free ride down the river. And, then the kayakers started showing up, and that's when I decided I'd do kayaking. But my favorite creek is Slippery Rock Creek, which is just north of Pittsburgh. It's through this glacial gorge that is just amazing with wildflowers and hemlock trees that haven't been affected by hemlock woolly algae. So yes, but I've experienced the environment in lots of different ways: hiking, kayaking, biking, just getting out there.
And also with us today is someone from Michael Calhoun from Vernonia, Oregon. And Michael, out in Oregon, I feel like you guys got some great waterways. What's your story out there in the water? How's it?
Gosh, well, we have near where I'm at the Nehalem River. I think it's one of the longest undammed rivers in the state. But I had a lot of fun on another one called the Deschutes, and they have different classifications for rivers. But that was really fun, and put the boat to the side, you're wearing your life vest, and you get in the river and you float down. And I was trusting them how safe it would be, and it was, but it didn't feel it at the time. But no, we got some good places in Oregon. And Southern Oregon got the Rogue River. It's a little more, it was part of the first Wild and Scenic Act for like wild rivers, also undammed. But that one can be pretty spicy for those that really like rough rivers. Yeah.
Yeah, I came across that up in Crater Lake, and that was probably one of the most terrifying rivers I've ever seen. And it was terrifying for you at home to envision it. It's all this volcanic rock that kind of lines the riverway, and it has these like eddies, and it's really I don't know, it's a little bit too much for me. I wouldn't want to personally be in that river, but maybe it's a little different downstream.
Lots of drops in elevation, which cause those things that kayakers like to slide down.
and walls, like really sharp walls.
Gorgeous, yes.
Michael, you're over in Vernonia, Oregon, and you're fighting the good fight on trying to help educate the town and community on trying to have sustainable nights in the town by responsible lighting. And I think last episode I forgot to ask the question, has there been any news on the decision? Because wasn't the decision supposed to be made in January if the town was going to switch over to warmer lights?
Yeah, so the update on that, we had an election in November, and then the new counselor, who was not as night friendly, was sworn in January 1st. So it made it more challenging. And then around January, February, basically the city's decision was they're okay with it, but the city doesn't want to pay for it. So I've looked into alternative funding, and there's an organization locally called Rose City Astronomers, Portland. Phyllis may like this. Portland's known as the Rose City. So Rose City Astronomers is advocates for astronomy, and they were willing to pool money together to fund the purchase of these bulbs. So that's where we're at right now, raising the funds to purchase so the city can install. But yeah, that's the update. They don't want to pay for it, as most cities kind of just don't, if they don't have to.
Yeah, this seems to be a common theme. Well, our last guest might be able to help us shed some thoughts on that, and that is Mr. Dr. Robert Massey. And this show we're going to talk about today actually really aligns pretty well to your strengths, doctor. So it's going to be really good to have you on the show. So you at home may not be aware, Dr. Massey is the Deputy Executive Director of the Royal Astronomical Society over in the UK. He's been doing astronomy thing for roughly 35 years. Robert, have you come across any funding related items on this? I feel like this is the hardest part. You know, you can get it so far along, you can get the policies in place, but then someone needs to pay for it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And that it's that persuasion piece, right? You know, going to city authorities, going to the population and saying, we'd like you to spend some money on this. There is this long-term benefit. It might even save you money if you're using less energy and your lighting is more efficient and you have a lower color temperature and so on. However, getting to that point is hard because the capital outlay won't be that low. And then telling people, well, this has long-term benefits when they have other crises is always a difficult thing. I mean, I think the environmental resonance helps. The idea that there's a biodiversity issue, or that's not an idea, the fact that there's a biodiversity issue is really important in that. The emerging evidence on human health as well. I think there is that opportunity right now to make this case and say, look, it's not, yes, it's money, but actually, in the scheme of things, compared to some of the things we have to invest in, like, say, healthcare, for example, this is a relatively low amount, and it's got those wider tangible benefits. And it's not just for astronomers. We will sit there, obviously, and talk about the benefits for us. Like, we can see dark skies, that humanity gets to enjoy that crucial bit of human heritage where they look up at an unfettered night sky is the word I tend to use. The idea that you enjoy one that isn't hindered by light pollution. But it isn't just that. It's such a big issue. And I think that's a real strength, actually, the idea that we line up with all these different organizations and say, we're all basically saying the same thing. We might have different motives. We may have different bits of evidence we bring to it, but we're all saying there's something that needs to be done about this. And it's timely, just as we did with, or we have done to lesser or greater extent with other environmental crises. I mean, globally, people recognize the issue the need to tackle climate change, and that's a coalition of interests. And I think light pollution as a key biodiversity, environmental, human health, and astronomical issue. I'm hoping we're in a good place that actually we can start to shift things more now.
Well, there's a lot of big challenges facing your field, astronomy, and it doesn't just derive from traditional.
There's a lot going on.
But yeah, I think that's a really good point. And man, if you just think about the lighting beforehand, you can avoid most of these issues.
Yeah, I mean, that's true in planning terms. When, in the UK, we need new housing. That's undoubtedly the case. We have a growing population. And part of our argument, we're not going to sit there and say those houses shouldn't be built. But what you do want to say is, look, this is an aspect of development, just as you put the right infrastructure in place to make sure that people have got clean water and decent internet access and transport links and all those kind of things. Then another consideration is that you minimize the environmental impact. And part of that has to be light pollution, to say, we're going to build new settlements. Let's make sure that they're compatible with that. I'm hoping that we keep managing to make that point and that it's understood and that there is that wider problem, because, the work of people like David Smith and Bud Light is there's a specific UK organization is very clear that there's, for example, an impact on insect populations. We wonder why there's a big fall off in the number of insects. Light pollution might be part of that explanation. So, our hope is always that we can get that wider view across, that we can say to people, there are a whole number of reasons why you should be doing this.
That's why we have Phyllis here. Phyllis is fighting a good fight for the gardens.
Exactly.
Real quick, before we get into the show, you live in, how do you say the town? What is it? How do you say that?
We say Lewis, which is not so different to the way you're pronouncing it in your script, I think.
Yeah, we call it Lewis here. And I've always wondered where that name came from. Now I know, obviously. So that is in England, right?
It is. It's in East Sussex, and I think the city in Delaware was named after it by William Penn. So really, really deep, pretty deep history there, several hundred years ago. And it was also the home of Tom Paine for a few years as well. He was a more or less a tax collector when he lived here, and before he went off to the US and wrote The Rights of Man. And there's still there aren't pubs named after him, but a lot of businesses celebrate his presence. So they would see him to the whole American Revolution and so on. It's a very big thing here.
Yeah, there we go. I didn't realize that.
Well, if you're ever over this way, then I'll happily show you some of the places. There's certainly some American tourists do enjoy seeing.
I know, just real quick, for sporting events, there's a big Eagles bar over on Passyunk and somewhere in London, because we have a Passyunk here, and it's a main corridor through the city of Philadelphia, and so you have Philly sports there as well. It's just little ties between the countries. No matter how much we tariff you guys. Just remember that, right?
We do.
Okay, let's kick off this episode with the satirical magazine, The Onion. I've always hoped to have an article from The Onion on here, and I was granted, as they put out this story of the rotation of the Earth plunges entire North American continent into darkness, and I presume it's not limited just to North America, unless we're on a flat Earth. Maybe we are. I don't know, Robert. But let's continue on. According to The Onion, the Earth is spinning uncontrollably through space, and its rotation is utterly beyond human control. Darkness victims describe hunger pangs, lassitude, and a slow but steady loss of energy, forcing many to lie down. This is horrible. It's what kind of society are we living in where you have this? I feel like a lot of people actually feel this way about night. This feeling about this fear, I think the underlying fear that the Onion put in here about night is very true. I don't know if anyone else is on board for maybe we could do an Operation Daylight Forever. I think we're halfway there.
I think there are probably people who would sign up to that, the idea of the 24-hour city and the rest of it, which in principle, it's not terrible. I've been out in Spain in the middle of the night. I've been, as a younger person, I was out in the middle of the night, obviously, and not just for things like astronomy, but, but do we really, really want to live our whole life like that, and accepting, I think maybe just an acceptance of the fact that there is a circadian rhythm, that there is day and night, that you can't defy this. And if you do, it doesn't make you very well. Maybe there's something in that. Yes, it's an inconvenience in the sense of if you're trying to do everything you do during the day at night, but why would you? Do you really want everything lit up that time? And if you do want that, then I suggest you move to the up north of the Arctic Circle and enjoy it for a few weeks and see how you get on, and make sure you've got some very thick curtains so you get some sleep.
Well, who really wants that 24/7 daytime, and that is the fine folks over at MSG. And you'll recall that the New York-based MSG has brought us great things like the Las Vegas Sphere and soon to be the Abu Dhabi Sphere, but fell short on their bid on the London Sphere thanks to a lot of community backlash against the installation of that. Well, the MSG team is actually looking to dumb down the Sphere a little bit, primarily because of the price it costs to keep these facilities operating 24/7. Essentially, there are giant LED screens shaped like a giant ball, and on the inside, it's kind of like the inverse of that. And these mini spheres would have a capacity of 5,000 people, which is a fourth the capacity of the full sphere. This new form of entertainment experience. It's kind of like the rage right now. Everyone wants entertainment. You see it when you go to sporting events. It almost feels like, if you're not having convulsions from the lights are going to change and flicker and do things, and everything's going to be part of that. And then you have the music set up to like a 90s dance club because for some reason we haven't moved beyond that in sporting events. Is this just a fad, or are experiential entertainments kind of just where we're going to be for the next 10, 20 years?
Yeah, on the MSG stuff, actually, I was involved in the campaign at some level to stop the MSG Sphere in London. And I'm glad we did. We put in evidence to the Greater London Assembly, which is the governing body for the city, saying this was antithetical to efforts to control light pollution. They had an environment committee that were looking at it. And then the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, rejected it. And there was some discussion in the press about London was going backwards by rejecting this wonderful thing. And I thought, no, good. I know it's a bright city. It's a capital city. There's plenty of light pollution there already. But the idea that you would add to it in such a grotesque way just seemed extraordinary. And what I find hard to fathom, I think, is regardless of why we want something like this, why does it have to be lit up on the outside as well? What kind of dystopian idea is that, where you think, well, you've got the experience of the people inside, but we're going to inflict it on everybody around them as well? I really don't understand that. Even in Vegas, city, which is hardly has an aversion to brashness, but the idea that you would do that, I just think is extraordinary. Where did the subtlety go? Just it has to not only be a dominant feature for the people inside, and I think you're quite right about that, but everybody outside as well.
It reminds me of when movie theaters in the 1950s were being challenged with TV. They started new ideas, Cinerama and 70 millimeter. And it sounds kind of similar to this, where more and more are built, but I think that eventually, like you said, they're not even getting the money to fill these places. So if they do build more, I see them closing down one by one till kind of like today. There is a 70 millimeter theater in Oregon, but there's just one. So they're everywhere all of a sudden. Then they close down. Then maybe the one in Las Vegas will be the holdout.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about the movie theater correlation. I wonder if that'll happen. The thing I loved about the Sphere story in London was that MSG was willing to give the neighbors blackout curtains.
It says it all, doesn't it? That's, we're going to pollute your environment, but don't worry, we're going to, that's just atrocious, isn't it? Yeah, I'm not going to make any friends with them, I'm sure, but yeah, it really Yeah, that's just not right. Come on. I mean, I think it was also the idea for me that you just take something which is in a place like Vegas and you put it in a European capital, any capital, assuming that everywhere in the world would be so grateful to have this and not recognizing the cultural difference, if nothing else. But anyway, yeah, I'm glad we defeated. I am glad we defeated it. I think, frankly, they weren't really making. I mean, apart from farcical things like that, they weren't really making any effort whatsoever to engage. And, it wasn't good enough. I'm very, very glad it got rejected. It's one of those rare victories, really, when something like that, you sit there and you think, oh, it's just going to happen. And it was really nice to see it didn't, to be quite honest.
Very happy for you guys to move out on that. But you asked before, and I think this is a common thought. It's like, how does light make you feel? And there's a new study out of Journal Sleep. It's found that blue and rich light actually kind of makes you feel good. And the study looked at 35 individuals, with just under 2/3 of them being young women aged around 20 years old, gauged responses to self-affirming and self-depreciating language in blue and rich light and blue depleted light, and have found that blue and rich light actually influences our mind to think in a more positive manner. So maybe it's not that shocking, considering our need for daylight and sunlight, that we would have this positive response.
But I think you're much better off going outside and getting blue light from sunlight when you can versus artificial light. And also the AMA, our American Medical Association, has proven our bodies don't function well 24/7 on that light.
I hope none of us here have 4,000 to 5,000 Kelvin lights in our home. But is anyone here excited to work in factories? Because I feel like that's good for productive, activity. But when Phyllis, you wind down, right? It's a different story.
Well, I was just going to say, yeah. And I think I understand the way these operations work. And in some cases, certain industries and so on, they can't shut down because the way the machines work. I'm having a conversation about steel furnaces here right now in the UK. But there is a price. And I think expecting people to operate on that basis for long periods of time is really tough. It's not good for you. Anybody who's ever worked night shifts knows it's not good for them. I haven't done that very much in my life. I've done it in a very intellectual way when I was doing astronomy research. I think that's quite different, obviously, to say being someone who's sitting in an Amazon warehouse or somewhere just sorting things through the night or many other businesses of that type. And nobody doing those things will tell you that they really relish working through the night. So, yeah, there's something about it. And I guess that the problem, I suppose, is that it feeds into such a broader aspect of society because we have assumptions about productivity. We have assumptions about when we get goods and all of those things. And if you unpick the idea that quite as many people are working through the night to deliver them, that there's a bigger impact too. So, but I certainly think we've got to have the debate and actually look at more than just saying, oh, you do, I don't know, a week of night shifts and then you get a week off and so on. It's probably not going to be enough to maintain people's health.
Well, on the health front, I have two articles here I'm just going to quickly go through. One's Frontiers in Public Health, looked at generalized levels of artificial light at night from satellite images and tried to correlate them to metabolic disorders like diabetes, obesity, etc. And there were about 11,729 participants who underwent physical evaluations, fasting blood samples, and the study concluded that there are positive associations with generalized light pollution metabolic diseases. I'll temper that conclusion. Most associated with propensity for these diseases appeared to reside in urban areas for which there is more light at night. The study was unable to tease out the confounding variables. However, in a separate study from environmental research, researchers looked at 831 children with an average age of 9 years old. They measured for 5 days the children's exposure to daylight over 100 lux and dim light over 1 lux. And the study found a modest but interesting association. While daytime light tended to be associated with a reduction in body fat by 3%, dim or greater light at night tended to be associated with an increase in body fat by 3%, with boys apparently showing a greater trend toward increased weight gain in dim daylight and bright nights. Michael and Robert, curious, how do you guys navigate the health topics? What's a good guiding principle for the listener at home?
Well, for me, I've done slices of every kind of topic when I present this in general. I've never solely focused on health. It's usually light pollution, impact to the environment. And I have mentioned about blue light in my presentations to the council, but for me personally, I haven't made that the main case, at least yet.
Yeah, I mean, we looked at it. There was actually a House of Lords and the UK Parliament, an investigation into noise and light pollution together and the impact on human health. And they did more on noise because the research is better established, I think. And, you know, there's more work needs to be done. There's one of our central points was that the evidence base needs to be firmed up. So we know there are issues. It is quite hard to disaggregate them because, you know, I guess quite often if you're doing sort of not very well paid shift work, you may have other comorbidities, cofactors in your life that, you know, mean they're not in the best health. But the evidence is there. It just needs to be a deeper base. And we were trying to argue that the government should prioritize that if it's looking at the way it funds science and so on, one aspect of this would be, well, we know this is a widespread pollutant. And so let's look at what it's actually doing to people more rigorously. There are people like there's Russell Foster at Oxford, actually a friend of mine, Hannah Dalglish, who used to be on our governing council. She's done some work in this area as well. And she persuaded these peers, you know, the unelected House of Lords, but it's there. It does some good work. She persuaded them to look at this issue in the first place. So credit to her. And she should come on your show sometime, actually, if she never has done before. There is other curious aspects as well. A guy named Bob Fosbury, who used to be an astronomer at the European Southern Observatory, he now works in ophthalmology with UCL. He's been doing some very interesting work about how the absence of not just, you know, just having narrow spectrum light has these other effects. And he describes it as being sort of almost like an artificial scurvy effect where you're not receiving infrared light is an issue too. So the way that white light inside is now, you know, bright white light, high temperature light is, that may be depriving you of various benefits there too. I mean, the obvious thing though, that Phyllis is quite right. You know, you want to get the best kind of light, then being out during the day under sunlight is the best way to do it. And it's very difficult to replicate that inside. But so there are things going on. And I think actually understanding that better would be a really good idea right now. You know, it seems unlikely to me that if it has this significant effect on invertebrates and mammals and birds and so on, why wouldn't that include us? So, you know, maybe it's time to do that work and take that more seriously.
Phils, do you have a recommendation for a specific kind of lighting for individuals in landscape?
2700 Kelvin is the light that I'm recommending now. It was around 3000 with regard to outdoor lighting. Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah, for exterior landscape, for when people are doing their gardens, and a good recommendation for how they should be lighting that space.
Well, it's down lighting, you know, to avoid the trend of uplighting the architecture of trees and reversing that light, because you can still enjoy the beauty of the tree at night, but just cast down the branches of the trees. And quite honestly, I'm not a big fan of light. So I'm still a proponent of saying, if you're not out there, then turn it off.
Well, I asked because Robert hit on it, that there's so many effects that hit across the ecological spectrum. And it seems like the best option is no light. The okay option is red light. And then anything else, you're kind of rolling the dice. You don't know where you're going to get. And in the gardening side, right, you want to have a healthy garden. And half of that involves your soil composition and the insects that you cultivate in that ecosystem. That was kind of my question, is like, they're going to want to light up their gardens. And when they do, what's the best recommendation on that?
2700 Kelvin, 3000 Kelvin. Lower that light bulb. There are some people I have convinced to maybe can't redo their whole lighting system. They go the amber light way. However, I try to explain to people that plants need light for photosynthesis. Most of us who have grown plants recognize that need that process that converts that sunlight into energy. But they also need periods of darkness for metabolic processes, most of which they suggest is for root growth regeneration. And in terms of trees under street lights, that causes them to hold on to their foliage in the fall much longer. And when they're holding on to the foliage in the fall, it means they're not going through the metabolic process of preparing themselves for winter. If it then gets cold faster than anticipated, it affects your plant's growth and their survival rate. in the long term. So when I try and explain some of the benefits of the plants they're investing thousands of dollars in to keep them healthy, in addition to the aspects, even, because in the winter, you're not dealing with pollinators. You're not trying to convince them to turn off the lights for pollinators. You're trying to ensure that they understand what the plant needs and tree needs are for darkness.
That's a good way to summarize it. I like it. Let's switch over an article from Nature, which appears to hint at some unforeseen effects across our whole planet. Right when we, not just looking at gardens or streets or pretty much, we're looking now at the chemical composition from satellites. The future estimates are now looking upwards of 40,000 low Earth orbit satellites to be up in orbit once the space economy fully takes off. For places like the new Vera Rubin Observatory, which hopes to take 1,000 wide field exposures per night, the only game plan really involves limiting the times of photography and avoiding the majority of satellite streaks, and then spending additional time in post-processing trying to remove those satellites. Radio observatories currently rely on communication coalitions between SpaceX and local governments to help reduce the impact. But still, there are areas that are affected by stray, streaky satellite transmissions, which sit outside of the SPECT range. There's also this issue. Re-entries add chemicals into the upper atmosphere. This past February, Starlink re-entered an average of 4 satellites a day, which will burn up in the atmosphere. According to the article, some studies have measured small but negative impacts on the ozone layer. Robert, on the atmosphere front, I know this is too soon to tell. What's it looking like? Do we have danger from dramatically increasing our deployment and re-entry of satellites?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is yes. Now, exactly how bad it is a really good question, and that's why there's all this preliminary work going on. And of course, you're right. It is too early to tell in the sense that we're seeing the ramping up of the use of low Earth orbit now. Now, what that demands is an increase in the number of launches, although they deploy more satellites than ever before. But also the protocols are that at the end of the life of a satellite, and with good reason, you're obliged to remove it from harm. So you shouldn't be leaving it there to act as a huge chunk of space debris and place, well, not just other satellites, but astronauts on the space station at risk, for example. So the usual approach is to what's called deorbiting, which basically means burning them up in the atmosphere. And some bits of that occasionally make it all the way to the ground. That's not great either. But there is this emerging concern about burning up a large amount of aluminium in the Earth's atmosphere, maybe effectively ramping it up even on current numbers to perhaps 7 times what would happen naturally from incoming meteorites. And what that does to the ozone layer in particular, because it acts as aluminium oxide, can act as a catalyst to encourage chlorine to destroy ozone. Now, this might all seem a bit unlikely, but then I would point to the fact that, we don't use CFCs in our fridges anymore. And I don't suppose that when CFCs were first used as a coolant in fridges, anybody had any idea that this was going to have an impact on the upper atmosphere of the Earth. So at the very least, there needs to be some real thought about this. I also would probably challenge the idea that you take something as expensive as satellite and simply set fire to it at the end of its life. It seems we wouldn't do that in other areas of life. And it's probably, I guess it's the way this has emerged is that we looked at a small number of satellites until 2019 when the first Starlink constellations deployed, and that the numbers were then set to ramp up with multiple providers, not just SpaceX, but across the world. And we've moved to a different place now, and so we need to take this much more seriously. Another parallel I would give, I guess, is that we used to, perhaps say in the 19th century and before, assume that the sea was an unlimited dumping ground and you could just throw stuff into it forever, and no one would really say that now. And I think we really have to start treating even the upper atmosphere of the Earth in the same way.
What would the option be if you don't deorbit it?
Well, you can do graveyard orbits, and I think perhaps, whether you elevate them to a higher orbit, obviously that then might fill as well. But you can also, I guess maybe it is about the way, what they're made from. I mean, there were some innovative ideas. I think it was a Japanese company made one out of wood, which sounds utopian, but if it works, it works. And also perhaps just think about making them last longer, or if there's a way at least to take a full-size satellite and reuse it, or extend, not just extend its life, but that's the kind of thing I think we're going to have to think about eventually. Certainly if you want to have not just tens of thousands, but eventually hundreds of thousands of satellites in orbit, it's time to be thinking about that. It's not just the impact on ground-based astronomy where we get annoyed with this cluttered sky, which I'm not a fan of, as you can imagine, because I think that has, apart from the impact on the science, the heritage issue as well, again, about not being able to escape this even. At least with ground-based light pollution, you can still just about travel to places in the world where you can avoid that. You can't escape this because it's everywhere all over the sky and pretty much all over the world as well.
Do you know what causes them to have to be deorbited so soon?
Oh, well, it's space debris management.
Is it because the orbit has come down to, they have a low orbit and are just naturally going to drop down?
You have, there's passive and active deorbiting. And so active deorbiting is firing a small thruster to slow it down and cause it to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. Passive deorbiting is where it's reaching the end of its life and it's decaying naturally and entering the Earth's atmosphere now. And by design, and it's done really to ensure that you don't have too much up there, because it's very hard to define a kind of carrying capacity, but certainly if you have too many things in orbit, then there's a problem. And there are things like the Kessler syndrome, the idea that you have the cascade of collisions and debris, because although you might think something like, say, a flake of paint coming out of one of these is pretty harmless, if it's traveling at many times the speed of the bullet, it really isn't. So, this is already an issue, and there's a lot of work going on to try and minimize that. One idea was burn everything up as much as possible in the atmosphere, but then there's this other unforeseen consequence that we really ought to be concerned about.
Well, our next doomsday issue, we have the European Southern Observatory release a technical analysis of the impacts of the proposed mega site, which is only 11 kilometers away. If you'll recall, the Chilean government has a real conundrum on their hands. On one side, they want to promote green energy. On the other side, they're home to major astronomical research facilities. And adds a further difficulty. I think both policies are backed by the government. So according to the ESO, light pollution would increase by a minimum of 35% for the Very Large Telescope and by 50% for the Chernikov Telescope Array Observatory South. And then the Extremely Large Telescope would expect to see a modest increase of 5% in light. Air turbulence, as any amateur astronomer is familiar with, would degrade the current stable seeing conditions by 40% due to proposed wind turbines, and construction operations would create vibrations that would render equipment like the Very Large Telescope's interferometer moot. Robert, the Earth is quickly becoming a place where you can't do Earth-based astronomy. Where else do astronomers go?
So this one, we actually wrote to our science minister and asked them to lobby the Chileans over this, because the UK is a member of the European Southern Observatory. It's got 16 member states, and it's a really important organization. And this is one of the sites in Chile are basically the best places in the world to do astronomy. It's why they're clustered with telescopes and why so many observatories are sited there. So if we don't protect that, then where can we do this science? And I think the argument we've been making as well is that this is important to Chile, that Chile is, a country that's moved officially beyond the level of being a developing country to industrialize one. This isn't a high technology part of their economy. It's something that plugs them in really well to the rest of the world with an incredibly advanced science. So we've been trying to make the argument, say, this is not just about protecting the site, but actually it has bigger ramifications as well. And it would be really disastrous. I mean, frankly, taking one of the best places in the world to do this and wrecking it seems a terrible idea. I do understand the conundrum about developing green energy, but one of the suggestion has been that the site can at least move, say, perhaps 50 kilometers away. The Atacama Desert's big enough. Now, I don't know it well enough to comment about whether that's feasible, but that is one proposed solution, that at least if it's moved away. And by the way, even if that's still done, I still think they ought to be doing as much as possible to constrain the light pollution at the very least, because the impact on that desert ecosystem there, albeit not much life, it's not the point. I don't doubt there are fragile species there. So we'll see, but I really hope that the Chilean government rethinks it. I think it's a decision at a sort of regional government level initially, and I very much hope that they don't go ahead with something like that, because really, trashing the best place in the world to do astronomy would be incredibly unfortunate.
And well, on top of that, how do you justify all the amount of public funds that went into building these observatories.
Well, and from international, exactly, from across European countries, it's a really, really big investment, and I think a massive scientific success story. So it would be a huge shame to trash that. I mean, the European Extremely Large Telescope, they're really, there are not very original names in these cases, but this is one of those telescopes that will do things like look for Earth-like planets around other stars. Trying to answer anyway those huge questions. And please don't trash it. Think about, the bigger picture here, what that means for the whole of humanity.
It's a trifecta right here. The last sign of the apocalypse is from Scientific American, and I apologize in advance because this one is definitely no less depressing. There are 2 Russian companies, one named Avent Space and the other Start Rocket, that are joining forces to aim lasers down to the Earth with the intent of showing us Earthlings something that none of us at all want, and that is more advertising. The companies plan to deploy up to 400 satellites at 370 miles above Earth, which would be app-controlled exclusively for the advertisers. Vlad Sinikov was quoted as saying, "Space is not for just scientists, not just for the military. It is entertainment too, and people like entertainment." That makes light of what the 2 companies are really trying to do, and that is, at least to me, turn our night sky into a hellscape of billboards. In the U.S., there's a federal law banning the launch of space advertising that was passed back in 2000, stemming from a Georgia-based company that wanted to do the same thing back in the 1996 Summer Olympics in Atlanta. And Robert, would this just be it? If you had space advertising, you're going to go to, selling donuts on the street or something? Like, what happens at this point?
I mean, look, it's grotesque, isn't it? I mean, imagine taking a natural landscape on Earth. Imagine Yosemite with a huge illuminated billboard in the middle.
Don't tempt the Trump administration on it.
I was going to say a word about that, but you're right. Yeah, but how outrageous and appalling that would be. So I would just say, look, this is grotesque. I have a feeling it might not happen. The Russians are at least at the moment, given the Russians are under a sanction regime and the rest of it, they might have some difficulty selling that space. But it's a terrible idea, and it wouldn't even work as they're suggesting. I mean, they were talking about it would just be switched on over cities. Of course, that's not going to be the case. It's bound to be visible from much further afield because the satellite is a couple hundred at least kilometers up. So, yeah, it's awful. And I think, I just don't even, do people actually want this? Apart from the companies, do people want to go out at night and be unable to escape advertising wherever they are on Earth? Surely we want some respite from this. As you say, I know how to buy a donut. I don't need an advert in the sky telling me how to do that. Not even with a QR code. Yeah.
I don't think anyone wants advertising, but I guess to play devil's advocate, what makes it different from a drone advertising experience? And you'll see these in certain areas that, have drones do advertising, like in a famous one, at least here in the States, is in Jersey City and Manhattan, right across the river from each other. And
I'm not a fan of that either, particularly. I have enough advertising in my life. Every time I browse the internet, it's not like I don't see ads all the time. So I'm not a fan of that particularly. But obviously it's the reach, right? If you have something which is, say, several hundred kilometers up and it's visible over thousands and thousands of square kilometers, that's very, very different to something which is local, maybe hundreds of feet up. Bad enough, though, that is, I find that a bit in my face, to be honest, and I don't need it. The idea that you decide that that's not enough, that even an area of a city is not enough for your reach for your product, that you've got to actually illuminate, I don't know, tens of millions of people at once. Really, that's the difference. I think it's absolutely a sense of scale. And at what point do we say that's too much? And I'm absolutely sure there's not going to be a great environmental impact from that as well. I can't imagine trying to thinking, about the idea of keeping gardens dim. Well, imagine trying to do that if you've got these things flying overhead so bright that everybody can see them.
You don't think it's going to have you buying at Heineken Zero? You don't think you're going to want to run right out if you see
Heineken Zero advertise even this? That's the last time I buy them. I think it's fair to say.
Well, let's get back down to earth here for a little bit. And Michael, you mentioned last episode you're a fan of vintage lighting, and I think this is a really interesting piece for you. Let's take a little step back off the ledge and go over to Queens, where not all residents were excited about the city's glow up of the Brooklyn Bridge. Some took to social media to express their dismay, claiming that the new LED lights imparted a harsh, blinding light on the glow of the bridge. And then one Instagrammer even stated that the oppressive new LEDs are like the 19th century Brooklyn Bridge is under interrogation by a belligerent cop. Queens resident Joe Pilato decided that it was his calling to purchase the old mercury vapor lights from the New York Department of Transportation's auction. For the price of $35 each, he purchased 123 of the 150, of which he was able to resell them to various collectors. And this line, I think it sums up, per Pilato, the white lights are certainly more clinical. I can see people being like, bleh, they were warmer and cozier before. Michael, how do you feel about that one?
I admire the person I saw reading the story, you know, for people that want the older technology. Personally, I've never felt the need to hop on the trend for new anything. What I'm doing here, we had a shop light installed. This is before I got into all this. It was LED, but you know what? We're getting it uninstalled and we're putting a high pressured sodium. So the world may be changing, but like I'm going to enjoy that. But other people in New York, they're seeing the difference of this bridge, how it's illuminated, and it the number one comment I always see is it's either harsh or they equate it to something that is harsh, like a hospital surgery room. You know, people even that aren't really into this world of light pollution, they don't, you know, they're, you know, it's just, they just use their eyes, they see it. So yeah, it's unfortunate to see these historic structures that are illuminated in such a way. Now I know the news here in Oregon, Portland, Oregon has a number of bridges spanning the Willamette River. There's an organization wanting to light them up with LED lights and to draw tourism that way, where they'd all be, you know, different colors. And I get it, but that is a conversation I'm hoping they're having with dark sky advocates. You know, is it going to be illuminated like, you know, all the time, or is it just for special events? So finding that balance, that it never ends.
Yeah, good luck on that one. You have to really, I think, insert yourself in that conversation. We have a new, and I know, Phyllis, I know over in your neck of the woods too, bridges and towers are a very special thing that people just love to light the living hell out of. And we have a new green trail that goes across town and actually is a boardwalk that cuts across a river. So swings around some industrial area and now connects the lower part of town. And in the middle, I don't know where they got the money for this, but they put this massive fancy bridge with these big towers in the middle, which of course they're going to bathe in light, because that's the most creative thing we can ever do is get a light out.
Yeah, even in Pittsburgh, after the dark sky ordinance took effect, somebody lobbied for lighting our bridges along the Allegheny River, and it's abominable.
Some company, you mean, Phyllis? Some
yes,
company lobbied.
Exactly.
Yeah, and we've had other articles on other stories of bridges being lit, but yeah, good luck with that, Mike. You have to really jump in on that. And it's interesting seeing, as you said, you know, people really don't appreciate the white. Like the white seems to, you know, it's like a 60-30 type approach to things. You know, people are just not a big fan of that. But anyway, let's close out tonight's show with a story. Phyllis, I apologize in advance because I know this has probably wreaked some havoc in your life. You would be the man who helped bring something that we know of as the gypsy moth, now called the sponge moth, which was transported over to the U.S. from France by French immigrant Etienne Leopold Trouvelot. And obviously those living outside of North America, they may not know the story, but here the rest is history. But it's not all too bad, Phyllis. Just because the gypsy moths are here doesn't mean he was a terrible, terrible guy. So in 1870, Trouvelot started down a road that would eventually lead him to work with multiple observatories, including the Harvard College Observatory, which housed a 15-inch telescope, the 26-inch telescope for the University of Virginia's Leander McCormick Observatory, and the U.S. Naval Observatory, which is also 26-inch. Plus, he would go on to publish in many scientific journals. Trouvelot, though, really got his start in astronomy after Harvard College Observatory director Joseph Winlock took notice of his detailed lithographic prints of local events he noticed on his Massachusetts farm, such as streaky illustrations of green and blue auroras. Obviously, time and technology will catch up to him. However, in between then and there, what is stunning is the quality of these lithographs, including breathtaking pictures of the zodiacal light, astounding renditions of the planets, great comet of 1881, and even the Orion Nebula. There are much more to see in the article via the show notes, but he even includes a super detailed moon illustration. I highly recommend if just take a look at the link. It's just really impressive what he did back in the turn of the century, around the late 19th century. So see, Phyllis, it's not the end of the world. The guy has some merit.
And also the native bees and birds finally took a liking to gypsy moth. They're not a problem for us in Pennsylvania as much as they used to be. But just like the stink bugs, eventually the critters catch on and decide that they can, in fact, eat them.
I mean, in fairness to critters, would you want to eat a steak or do you want to eat tofu? I'm just saying. There you have it from me. I want to thank my guest, Dr. Robert Massey of the Royal Astronomical Society. Dr. Massey, where can people learn more about the work that you do?
Well, the RAS has got our website. We've got a YouTube channel. We're very active on different social media channels, particularly including things like Blue Sky now. We're really growing our presence there. And you can find me personally in those places as well, and also on LinkedIn. And if anybody's genuinely interested, then connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm not as diligent as I should be about posting things there, but I do from time to time.
And we have landscaper and the owner of Landscape Design Studio, LLC, Phyllis Gricus. Phyllis, I wish I knew how to pronounce your name. You
just did it.
No, in the first episode, I apologize completely, but I got Gricus here. I think I nailed it this episode. Score some points on my end. But if you're interested in learning more about what Phyllis does, how can people find you and where can people learn more about the projects that you're working on?
Well, they can start on my website, landscapedesignstudio.com. And there I have many of the articles I've written available for you to download and read. Also Instagram. And since Robert mentioned Blue Sky, I'm there too. I forgot.
We should follow each other. We should do that.
And I think that's an exciting move from me. And I'm not very good at keeping up with social media. It's my least favorite part of my job, but I'm working on it.
And then lastly, but not least, conservationist Michael Calhoun. Michael, for any Pacific Northwest folks listening today and interested in learning more about the work that you do, how can they connect with you and maybe lend a helping hand?
They can find me on LinkedIn, Michael Calhoun, Vernonia, Oregon, and I'm always posting different articles about projects I'm working on. But I really do enjoy networking with folks, and that's how we share ideas and learn from each other and grow from there. So definitely just hit me up.
Yeah, I'm interested in learning the outcomes that you have over there. So definitely keep me in the loop and good luck. If you think of it from a purpose-driven area and not say, I need light, just give me light. If it's purpose-driven, you can come up with some really good solutions. Yeah, I think we have a good opportunity there. So good luck. I want to thank you, the listener, for joining us today. As a reminder, Light Pollution News is a listener-supported show, which means that we take no outside advertising and solely rely on the support of you, the listener. So if you like what we do, why not consider helping us out? Why don't you go over to our website and you can help support the show. If you heard anything on the show that makes you want to shoot over a comment or question, feel free to either text us via the text link in the show notes or send an email to me, bill@lightpollutionnews.com. You can also find us online, lightpollutionnews.com, on the socials, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, TikTok, and more. And today's show was recorded on April 19th, 2025. I'm your host, Bill McGinney, thanking you for listening today. And remember to only shine the light where it's needed.